Bagage, on a 20 ans. On a des réserves de printemps.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it's time for us to start the third day of this exciting conference. For 2 days, we have been exploring the problems space. So let's move on and let's spend today wandering around the solutions space. This plenary session is going to consist of 2 parts. In the first part, you are going to hear 3 distinguished scholars delivering their keynote speeches. Afterwards, we are going to hear 3 not less distinguished scholars in a panel debate. We are also very privileged to have with us Jean-François Susanna from the organizing committee, who is going to be with us during the whole session. So, without much further ado, I would like to introduce our first keynote speaker. In fact, none of our 3 keynote speakers need any introduction, but still allow me a couple of sentences to still say something about them. Our first speaker is Dr. Fatih Birol. Dr. Birol starts as the next executive director of the International Energy Agency in September. Presently, he holds the positions of chief economist and Director of Global Energy Economics. In this role, he oversees the IEA's flagship World Energy Outlook publication. I guess many of us have grown up on this publication, both academically and perhaps many other ways, which is recognized as the most authoritative source of strategic analysis of global energy markets. He has also been member of the UN Secretary General's high-level group on sustainable energy for all, and was named by Forbes magazine among the most influential people in the world's energy scene. Dr. Birol, the floor is yours.
So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure and a privilege to be invited here today. As you may have understood, we are an energy organization. So I will try to provide our perspective on climate change from the energy angle. And my brief remarks will be based on a report we published 2 weeks ago, Energy and Climate Change, which can be downloaded in the web freely in our IEA's website. So, when we look at the current picture, we all know that this beautiful city of Paris will be a host to an extremely critical meeting for all of us. And we have less than 6 months for this meeting. And when we look at the momentum, the political momentum, I see rather optimistic signs. First of all, the 2 largest emitters, US and China, which make close to half of the global CO2 emissions, had an historical agreement last November, and both of the countries made their pledges in line with that announcement. I think more than the numbers, the political ambition of the President Xi and President Obama gives us some right to be hopeful. But of course, one of the champions of fighting against climate change was EU. The EU 2030 target with a very ambitious plan was very important. And these 3 important blocks, US, China and EU, the political move from there is very important. And another reason to be hopeful is that unlike the previous attempts, such as Kyoto, I have colleagues here who follow the Kyoto meeting very closely, we have now both developed and developing countries are making commitments, highlighting the very global nature of the challenge we are facing today. And also energy companies, which are at the heart of the equation. Because most of the investments for energy infrastructure is carried out by the energy companies. We see some move from the energy companies in the direction of sustainable development and making their investments accordingly. However, it is not at a level that we would like to see. My humble advice to the energy companies today is that if they think that their businesses, whatever energy business they do, their businesses are immune to the impact of climate policy, they are making a strategical mistake. Any energy company in the world, whatever they do, oil, gas, renewables, efficiency, coal, whatever they do, climate policies will impact their businesses. So in order to not to make wrong decisions, investment decisions, in terms of making investments which may not bring the right returns, or in terms of missing investment opportunities, businesses may need to take the climate policy and their impact for their businesses more seriously, I believe. So why do we, as the International Energy Agency, come with a proposal for the COP meeting that I will outline at the end of my time? Because, very simple, energy production, the energy sector, are responsible about 2/3 of the emissions. This is our responsibility to find a solution to the climate problem by pushing forward the energy policies which would help to address this very serious threat. In other words, without solving the problem in the energy sector, we have no chance, I believe, to address the climate change problem. But we, as the IEA, we are also aware that the climate change is one of the most important components of the energy world today, but it is not the only one. There are other preoccupations of the energy decision makers, and rightly so, ranging from boosting the economic growth, and energy is very important for the economic growth, energy security being a major preoccupation in many countries, and as we have been highlighting since a decade, the energy access. 1.2 billion people having no access to electricity is another concern, and they all need to be taken together. Now, I am talking about the optimistic signals in terms of the political momentum, and there is one other signal or data which makes me hopeful, which we published a few, I think, 2 months ago, which is the following. In the last 4 decades, almost 40 years, we have the good data of energy-related CO2 emissions. For the first time, ladies and gentlemen, last year, carbon dioxide emissions did not increase, even though the global economy grew. Last year, we have seen that the CO2 emissions were at the level of the previous year, even though the world economy increased over 3%. In the history, we have seen only 3 times that the CO2 emissions did not increase, but they were all as a result of the recession, what we have seen in the global economy. This is mainly as a result of 3 important drivers. There are many of them, are 3 important. Renewable energies, making a big move. About 50% of all new power plants come on stream in 2014 worldwide was renewable energies. 50% renewables, 50% all others put together, coal, oil, gas, nuclear, and others. This is one. Second, efficiency policies, which were being pushed by several governments since few years, they are bearing fruits, especially end-use efficiency. And the third one is China. Chinese coal consumption since many, many years, for the first time, did decline, and it helped the global CO2 emissions, these three drivers, not to increase for the first time since many, many years. Now we are coming to Paris, a very important meeting, and another good point for Paris is that unlike other international meetings, all the countries, as far as I know, agree that the climate change is a global threat, full stop. But now the question is, and the barrier, I believe, in front of having a deal agreement which will give us the right signal is that who is going to do what? The discussion is not anymore climate change is a major problem or not, but the discussion is now who is going to do what, and the problem comes from the following picture, which is at the heart of the debate, namely, when we look at the past emissions, which are still affecting the climate change, the developed countries, so-called OECD countries, were responsible about 2/3 of the emissions. There is a big responsibility there, and I have to admit that. But when you look at the future, we see that the developing nations are going to put a lot of carbon in the atmosphere if there is no change in their policies. I mentioned the success story in China, but if China wouldn't change the policies, which I hope they will do as shown in the INDC, the emissions which will come from China in the next 25 years will be equal to the emissions coming from US plus all European countries plus Japan together. India is growing in terms of emissions in line with economic growth, but on a per capita basis, even 20 years of time, Indian per capita emissions are much lower than many other countries in the world. So the point of departure in terms of the responsibilities is not a straightforward one at this stage. So what we have done in our report is we said countries are coming with INDCs, many countries. And what does it mean for the world, especially for the energy world? When we look at the countries coming with INDCs, the submitted ones, they are very encouraging in terms of, first of all, the participation. Developing nations, such as Gabon, Ethiopia, Morocco, Mexico, Russia, United States, it covers many, many countries, and altogether, according to our analysis, more than 2/3 of the emissions now are covered by the INDCs. And of course, there are other countries who give the signal. And when we look at all of them, we said whether or not these INDCs are going to change the energy world, which is very important in turn for the future emissions. So our answer is yes. Even though some of us may think these INDCs, in some cases on the modest side, they will have a material impact on the energy sector. In 2030, ladies and gentlemen, about 1/4 of the global energy will come from clean energy sources. And much more importantly, energy efficiency improvement will accelerate 3 times compared to current and historical trends. Very good news. About 60% of the new power plants will be coming from renewable energies, especially solar, wind, and hydropower. And China will be the leader here, especially in terms of solar and hydropower. In terms of fossil fuels, oil demand growth slows down in the INDC world, in those commitments, and natural gas sees some increase in their share, but the biggest hit comes to coal, especially in the OECD countries, in the US, Europe, and Japan, while we see a very strong slowdown in China and also in India. So this is changing the energy world and moving the energy world in a more sustainable manner. Is it enough? No. But is it a good step? Yes. And in terms of CO2 emissions, we see that they give a good signal for the next 15 years with the hope that it will provide a political momentum and inertia, but they will not bring us to the much needed 2 degrees target as they stand now. Therefore, and this is my last slide for the last few minutes, we as the IEA, we are coming up with 4 demands from Paris as the energy sector. Because I believe if the Paris Agreement, if we have any, if the Paris Agreement doesn't have the energy sector at its core, it risks to be a failure, given the emission numbers coming from the energy sector. So what do we want as the International Energy Agency from Paris? 4 things we would like to see in the agreement. First, we would like to see that the policy agreements are there in the text so that we see a peak around 2020 of the emissions. And this is the only way that we can secure that we can reach our climate goals in the future, including to reach the 2 degrees or below. Second, the energy sector, innovation, technology changes all the time, and we hope to see that those commitments and INDCs are revised every 5 years in order to understand where we are with our commitments, whether or not we can revise our commitments in the life of the technological developments. 5 years ago, ladies and gentlemen, the cost of solar was about 4 times more expensive than today. Perhaps in 5 years of time, solar or any other technology may well be a viable option. Then the countries may take them into consideration and they may want to revise their INDCs. So we believe the commitments, INDCs, pledges need to be revised every 5 years. Third, we need a target. 2 degrees is important, definitely, but it's a target in terms of the temperature. The energy sector needs concrete targets in terms of emission reductions. We would like to see, as the energy sector, in the year X, global emissions need to be reduced by Y%, and this will give a signal to the energy investments, energy industry. Only through that, the investment decisions will go through the right channels and provide also guidance for the investments to be made. And fourth and the last demand of the International Energy Agency is we would like to track what is going on in the energy sector in each country, namely power sector, power plant emissions, or the fuel efficiency standards and the CO2 emissions coming from the cars in every country. And this can be done in a matrix. There are many, many indicators, and this need to be, every country's performance need to be tracked, published, and presented in a transparent way so that we can see that countries are in the right way or in the wrong way. This is not that we don't trust the governments. Of course, we trust the governments, most of them, but we would like to see that they are doing the right work. And if somebody is not doing the right work, this should be under the observation of all other countries. So, ladies and gentlemen, to sum up, there is a political momentum which is encouraging. Some data coming from the energy sector is encouraging, but they are not strong enough to make us feel that we will have a much-needed agreement in Paris. Therefore, energy sector, we believe, need to be very active, very vigilant to get the right signals from Paris so that the current investments and investment for the next years are done in the right way and we do not lock in our future. Thank you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dr. Birol, thank you very much for this extremely powerful and motivating speech. Now, let's go on and complement this by further insights from science by our next keynote speaker, Professor Ottmar Edenhofer. Dr. Edenhofer is the Deputy Director and Chief Economist at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. In 2012, he was appointed director of the newly founded Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change. Furthermore, he is professor of the economics of climate change at the Berlin Institute of Technology and advises the World Bank within the advisory committee on the Green Growth Knowledge Platform. In January 2015, Ottmar Edenhofer was elected a member of the German National Academy of Sciences and Engineering due to his outstanding scientific achievements. Being one of the 3 co-chairs of Working Group 3, Dr. Edenhofer led the 5th assessment cycle of the IPCC Working Group 3. He authored a considerable number of articles published by Science, PNAS, Nature Climate Change, and in various other high-ranking environment, energy, and resource economic publications, as well as various books. Ottmar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Diana. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I tried to find a reasonable division of labor between Fatih and myself. Fatih was quite optimistic today, and as an economist, I represent the dismal science. So I start very pessimistic. But due to the fact that I have also a degree in theology, I end my presentation a little bit more optimistically, with some hope. But let me start with the depressing insights. And the most depressing insight is that emissions are rising, and they are even rising with an increasing growth rate over the last decade. So we have tried to figure out within the IPCC what are the reasons for this ongoing increase in the emissions, and we have decomposed the growth of emissions basically in 4 components: economic growth, population growth, energy intensity, and carbon intensity. And what you can see is in this figure that despite of the remarkable improvements in energy efficiency, all these improvements have been overcompensated by economic growth and by population growth. And in the last decade, economic growth has played the most important role. But in addition to this development, there is really a very worrying development, and this is the increasing carbon intensity. Over the last decade, we have seen not at a global scale a decarbonization pathway. Instead, we see a carbonization pathway. So 2 days ago, we have published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science where we have analyzed the reasons for this global coal renaissance a little bit in detail. And what you can see here is that this is exactly consistent what we have done within the IPCC, that economic growth is the most important driver. We have seen a lot of energy efficiency improvements. However, and this is quite important, despite of the progress in the sector of renewables, which has contributed to emission reductions significantly, we see now an increasing carbon intensity which has overcompensated the success of the renewables. And we see now a carbonization pathway because of cheap and increasingly available coal. And this drives the carbonization of the global energy system. So this is a comparison between all countries, and in particular, a detailed analysis on the non-Annex I countries. And what you can see here is that in the business as usual scenario, the empirical data are already above the most pessimistic scenarios, where you can see the share of coal without CCS on total primary energy. And this is a quite significant fact, because many people has accused the scenario builders, and in particular the IPCC, they exaggerate in their business as usual scenario the importance of coal. But this is not the case for the non-Annex I countries. And in addition to that, it is in particular worrying that we observe now a carbonization pathway, in particular in Africa. Here in the most prosperous countries like Congo, Benin, and Angola, where you can see significant economic growth, you see also high average growth of emissions, and you can also see that in many of these countries we see large-scale investments in coal power, at least under construction. So the 6 sub-Saharan African countries are among the top fastest growing emitters globally. Until now, the carbonization is majorly driven by natural gas and coal, but coal is getting increasing attention also in countries without own coal reserves. And this is due to the fact that we see an increasing global coal market. Now, this is where we are. This is the business as usual scenario. What are our goals? Now, the global community has committed to limit the increase of global mean temperature around 2 degrees. And what IPCC told us is this can be translated in a budget. The budget left for carbon is 1,000 gigatons CO2. And this can be translated into an emission reduction profile by the mid of the century between 40 to 70%. And this range is fundamentally driven by technological uncertainty, in particular about the availability of carbon dioxide removal technologies. I know that negative emissions and in particular carbon dioxide removal technologies are under debate. It's a hotly debate, and it is a quite important debate, because what this shows is that climate policy achieving low stabilization targets is no longer just an issue to decarbonize the energy sector, the power sector. It's fundamentally also a change in land use patterns, which has been managed by us, by human beings. Now let me explain a little bit what does this mean in terms of sectors. Here you can see the contribution to emissions from the different sectors: land use change, electricity, transport, building, and industry. So in the case that we want to achieve roughly a 2-degree target, these are the contributions of the different sectors. And this is the story which has been already told us, that the power sector has to contribute mainly to the decarbonization strategy. However, and this is quite important to understand, when carbon capture and storage, for example, is not available, or bioenergy is too risky, so then the land use sector has to contribute more, basically and mainly by afforestation. So what you can see here is, so low stabilization targets need also policy instruments in the land use sector and reasonable management tools in order to overcome inherent synergies between climate protection, food security, and biodiversity. And this is also due to the fact, or this causes the fact, that the largest potential to increase the mitigation costs has the absence of carbon capture and storage and bioenergy, because these are the most important technologies to provide negative emissions. But let me say one word of caution. When we talk about negative emission and carbon dioxide removal technologies, these technologies cannot be used as a hedging strategy. We cannot allow to continue with a business as usual scenario and hope that after the mid of the century, carbon dioxide removal technologies will solve the problem. Carbon dioxide removal technologies can only play a complementary role when embedded in a reasonable mitigation strategy, which includes all the relevant technologies in the low stabilization portfolio. Now, the next few slides are admittedly marvelous, but due to the time, I will skip them and I will tell you just the story. So the same like the limited availability of specific technologies, a delay of mitigation has also its risk. It does not just impose the burden on the future generations for emission reduction, it also requires a rapid increase, a rapid upscaling of low carbon technologies. And this rapid upscaling has its own underlying risks, and therefore it would be wise to start with mitigation now. So now I will skip all the slides. They are really very good, but nevertheless, due to the time, so you can read them on the internet. Now let me explain a little bit what is the fundamental of the economics of mitigation. This is my favorite slide. I told you that there are 1,000 gigatons CO2 left to be released into the atmosphere in order to limit the increase of global mean temperature around 2 degrees. However, we have 15,000 gigatons CO2 underground. So when carbon capture and storage is available, is acceptable and affordable, this means that 70% of coal, 1/3 of oil, and 1/3 of gas, which we use economically otherwise, has to remain underground. If carbon capture and storage is not available, 90% and 2/3 of oil and gas has to remain underground. What are the economic implications? The economic implications is that climate policy devalues the assets of the owners of coal, oil, and gas. And this might be the reason why many owners are not so excited about institutions like the IPCC. I see fundamentally 3 options to deal with that problem. The first one is believing in miracles. As a Catholic, I believe in miracles, but I do not rely on them. So what is the miracle? The miracle would be that tomorrow, the levelized costs of electricity for wind is far below the extraction costs of coal. This might be the case in a few decades, but it is very unlikely that this will happen tomorrow and would be unwise to rely on such a prediction. The second option would be we compensate the owners of coal, oil, and gas for remaining the massive reserves and resources underground. This has unfavorable distributional implications, and in addition to that, this creates an additional incentive for them to explore for additional fossil fuels. I see only a third option, and the third option is we need carbon pricing. In the future, the carbon prices have to reflect the scarcity, the most fundamental scarcity in the 21st century. And the most fundamental scarcity in the 21st century is the limiting disposal space of the atmosphere. Carbon pricing is not sufficient, but carbon pricing is essential, and it is a necessary condition for any kind of climate policy. Now, if you talk to prime ministers and to finance ministers and ask them, please implement the carbon price, the immediate response is, we are not committed to political suicide. Most of them perceive the implementation of carbon prices as an incredible risky game. Why is this the case? From my point of view, this is the case because many people ignore one important fact, one important advantage of carbon pricing. And the most important advantage of carbon pricing is you can get revenues. And the most important thing is, from my point of view, and we need a discussion, what is the most efficient, the most socially desirable way to use these revenues? And we can use these revenues in particular to start the fight against poverty and to finance the sustainable development goals. Investments in clean water availability, in sanitation, telecommunication, and access to clean electricity is not just good for the poor, it also improves the competitiveness of large parts of our economies. So we have done a calculation, a rough calculation, showing that just the removal of fossil fuel subsidies could allow us in many parts of the world to provide universal access to clean water and to clean electricity. So this map shows you that just the removal of fossil fuel subsidies allows in many parts where you have the red areas, where just the removal of the subsidies is sufficient to finance all these infrastructure investments. And the whole thing looks much better if you start with a moderate carbon pricing, here in particular in the African countries. Remember, in the African countries, we will see now massive investments in coal. These countries now are at a bifurcation point. For them, it is absolutely crucial that carbon pricing can be implemented in a way which helps also to reduce the inequality and to fight against poverty. But the nice story here is that carbon pricing provides such an option. And this is very important to understand. In other parts of the world, carbon pricing revenues could be used to reduce other distortionary taxes or to reduce public debt. So let me summarize. I have started my presentation to explain you that we are not on track. Instead of a decarbonization pathway, we carbonize our economy. Second, I have tried to show you that 1,000 gigatons left as the limiting disposal space into the atmosphere is a quite demanding goal, so to say, and we have to start with our decarbonization pathway very soon. The main problem from my point of view is not technology, and the main problem is not the macroeconomic costs. To say it in a very simple word, it does not cost the world to save the planet. However, the institutional challenges are huge, and in particular the institutional challenges to implement a carbon price. However, and this is very important to understand, there are many domestic motivations for countries already now to implement a carbon price, even if they are not primarily interested in climate change, but in financing sustainable development goals. And my last point is, I hope that Paris could send a strong signal, sooner or later, that we start also at an international level negotiating carbon pricing. I'm not arguing that carbon pricing is sufficient. We need many more complementary policies. But without carbon pricing, I have serious doubts that we can deal with the ongoing renaissance of coal. Now let me end with a hopeful statement. Carbon pricing could help us to deal and to solve the climate problem and at the same time to fight against poverty. Anyway, if we fail in one instance, we fail in another. We have now an option to solve both, the climate problem and the poverty problem in synergy. We have this option and we should take the decisions according to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Otmar, for this very insightful speech. And we are grateful that you did leave us with a couple of positive thoughts beyond just relying on our beliefs. Now, mitigation, even if we succeed, is still not going to solve the entire problem. We have already seen that the Earth has warmed, with already observed many impacts that we have seen over the last 2 days. Therefore, we also need adaptation very strongly in the solution space. So let's devote the final keynote speech to this issue. And we are very privileged to have Professor Sonamul Hook with us to discuss the issue of adaptation. Professor Hook is a director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development, based at the Independent University in Bangladesh. Prior to his professorship there, he headed the climate change program at the International Institute for Environment and Development in London, UK. He is also a co-chair of the Scientific Steering Committee of the Global Program on Vulnerability, Impacts and Adaptation, and has been a coordinating lead author on adaptation to climate change in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th assessment reports of the IPCC. He's an expert on adaptation to climate change. Professor Hook, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Diana, and good morning to everybody. Let me start with an apology. For those of you who are addicted to PowerPoint slides, I'm afraid you're going to have to go cold turkey. I don't have a PowerPoint slide. You'll just have to listen to me. So what I'm going to do is to take you through some reflections, and these are very much personal reflections, of where we are in the adaptation solution space and the adaptation science space. And I'll start by recollecting a discussion or a debate that occurred 5 years ago at the first adaptation science conference called the Adaptation Futures Conference, which was held in the Gold Coast in Australia, where Professor Neil Adger, who is a very eminent adaptation expert at the University of Exeter and a lead author of the IPCC for many years, and I had a little debate in which the question was, is adaptation science a separate science? And his argument was that it isn't. It's just usual science of natural sciences, social sciences that needs to be brought to bear, and that is sufficient. I argued that it may not be a science yet, but it is a science in the making. And in 10 years from now, it will be a science. And I will assert that 5 years since then now, it is very much a science. It's still a young science, but it is a science. And the presentations at this conference and the posters at this conference are a very good testimony, in my view, to the fact that it is now a growing body of work on climate change adaptation taking place across the world, and that we are certainly going up in a very rapid knowledge curve on developing our understanding of it. And I'll use the IPCC assessment reports as a sort of marker or indicator of this. The first assessment report, which came out 20 years ago in 1990, 25 years ago, was very much in the working group 2, which is on vulnerability, impacts, and adaptation, focused on impacts based on models looking at what the future would be under different climate change scenarios up to 2050, 2080, 2100, and you are all familiar with the maps of the world that increasingly get redder or browner as we go through time. Those are the impacts of climate change, and those alerted the world to the problem of climate change and the need to do something about it. A few years later, when we had the second assessment report, we had better modeling on the impact side, but we also went into a lot more on the vulnerability side, which is on the ground. Now, from an impact top-down model, you would look at a delta region like like the Netherlands and Bangladesh, and they look very similar. But when you visit Bangladesh and Netherlands, they don't look very similar. The Netherlands has a lot of economic power, it has technology, it can build protection for its population, whereas Bangladesh cannot. And so the underlying vulnerability of the nation, the community, the place, the city has to now be taken into account if we are going to do something about the problem. And so the second generation focused on a bottom-up vulnerability assessment combined with the top-down impact assessment. It's only in the third assessment report of the IPCC that we then moved into the issue of adaptation. And adaptation was only part of one chapter, and that's when I joined the IPCC as a lead author. I was one of the lead authors of that chapter, chapter 18, where we started to talk about adaptation. In the fourth assessment report, it became central. There were 2 chapters on adaptation. I was a coordinating lead author of one. And in the fifth assessment, there are 4 chapters on adaptation, chapters in Working Group 2, chapters 14, 15, 16, and 17. And I'll give you a very short description of them. 14 talks about planning. 15 talks about implementing adaptation. 16 talks about the limits and barriers to adaptation, because you can't adapt to everything. And 17 talks about the economics of adaptation, which can be quite costly. But it shows you how both the literature has grown and the interest of the policymaking community has grown on the issue of adaptation. And I will also argue that when you move from impacts and vulnerability assessments, which are essentially analysis of the problem and getting better at analyzing the problem, into adaptation, you're actually moving a phase change into solution space, which is the topic of this session. Adaptation is about solving the problem, not just studying the problem. And so it takes me to my second argument, which is that our knowledge on adaptation is going to evolve by combining practice and learning. So it's a learning by doing process, which means we have to do something and then learn from it, and then hopefully do something different and better in the next phase. And I think of these in half-decade scale, 5-year increments, which ties in also neatly with the INDC 5-year review process. Every 5 years, we assess where we are on adaptation. What have we learned by doing things? And then we can plan the next 5-year process of how we do that. I'll also mention the evolution of the scientific community on adaptation. I mentioned the first international conference on adaptation science, or adaptation futures, in Australia. Since then, we've been doing this conference every 2 years, supported by Provia. You heard about the global program on vulnerability, impacts, and adaptation. And we had the second conference in the United States, in Arizona, in 2012, and we had the third conference recently in 2014 in Fortaleza in Brazil, where and typically we get 600-700 people to these conferences, mainly young researchers working on adaptation. The next conference, for those of you who are interested, will be in Rotterdam in the Netherlands from the 14th to the 16th of May. And in fact, the theme for that is also solutions. So moving from studying a problem to doing solutions to the problem, and then learning from those solutions to the problem. And we are now moving into that solution space very rapidly. So even though it's a very young science, I'm going to share with you a couple of dimensions in which I think we have moved forward. The first dimension is the dimension of scale. We initially used to think of adaptation as being very localized. It's very context-specific. Every place has its own vulnerabilities. The population has its own vulnerability. And the solutions will have to be done at the local level. That remains true at local and national level. But there are also larger dimensions. There are ecosystems which have similarities, large deltas like the Delta, Ganges Delta, the Nile Delta, the major other deltas of the world, high mountain ecosystems in different continents, drylands in different continents. These ecosystems have a great deal in common with each other. And therefore, we can learn across continents on how to deal with adaptation in those different ecosystems. And finally, at the global level, we now have another dimension of adaptation, which is the potential migration of people from one place where they will not be able to inhabit, particularly some low-lying atoll islands in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. And we will have to deal with the movement of population that's a global problem that we have never faced before. And that, in a sense, is also an adaptation. People are going to have to move from where they are. Then we also have other dimensions which, at a conceptual level, and I'll share that with you, we used to think at the initial phase of dealing with maladaptation. So we'd look at vulnerability and we find that a lot of things that we are doing, like building on floodplains, for example, are actually making us more vulnerable rather than less vulnerable. So the first adaptation, if you like, is stop making ourselves more vulnerable. Stop doing maladaptation, because we're already going in the wrong direction and doing maladaptation. I think to a very large extent this has now been examined and agreed and assessed. We then moved into the second phase, which we are in now and well into it, which is incremental adaptation. So looking at future investments, particularly investments in infrastructure like bridges and embankments and roads. How do we climate-proof these investments in future based on future models of climate change, which are no longer going to be an extension of the previous decades of climatic changes? So this is now being incorporated. People like the World Bank, for example, major development banks, and even commercial infrastructure banks are taking on board the fact that they need to plan according to the potential impacts of climate change and incorporate an additional factor on adaptation. Typically in infrastructure projects, it might add a little cost, maybe 3%, 5%, no more than 10% to the cost, and they can absorb that and put it in so that the infrastructure can be, as it were, climate-proofed. This is now happening. Where we are at the moment is on the threshold of moving into the next phase, which in the IPCC fifth assessment is called transformational adaptation, which is not just looking at adaptation as a risk that needs to be dealt with, which is true, but also as an opportunity that we come out the other end better off than we were before. And I'll cite the example from my country in Bangladesh of people living in the coastal area, fishers, farmers, where there is already salinity intrusion, and in time they may simply be inundated by sea level rise over the next few decades. Now we know that. They will not be able to continue that. What we can do, though, is we can educate the children so that they don't have to be fishers and farmers themselves. They don't have to live there. They can become engineers, doctors, lawyers, move to the city, and then take their families with them when they want to. That is an example, in my view, of a potential, we haven't done it yet, transformational adaptation, where we use the problem to find a solution that ends up leaving us better off than we were before. My final set of comments is to do with the nature of this co-production of knowledge. As I said, it's a learning by doing, which requires that the research community, the academic community, the theoretical community, as it were, need to collaborate effectively with the practitioner community, both the planners, decision makers at the global and national level, sectoral level in agriculture, health, and other sectors, and practitioners on the ground, farmers, fishermen, people on the ground, ordinary citizens. They all need to be part of this process of adaptation, and they need to be part of this process of co-production of knowledge on adaptation. And those of you who attended the parallel session yesterday on co-production will have heard a number of very good examples of scientific community reaching out to decision-making community in different countries in trying to co-produce the knowledge on adaptation to climate change. How do? We practice, we learn, we practice again, but differently, and so on, going up what I call the adaptation knowledge ladder. I would like to add one more dimension to that notion of co-production, which traditionally we think of scientists working with other communities, with another notion of co-production, which is the South and the North, the developing countries and the developed countries. The traditional paradigm that we have, which is true for mitigation and also true for many other arenas of human endeavor and science, is that science research gets done in the North and then gets transferred to the South. The rich countries do the research, they come up with the technologies. This is very true for mitigation technologies, and then those need to be transferred to the developing countries. It's a technology transfer, north to south. I would argue that when it comes to adaptation, that is not the only dimension, and indeed, in fact, the reverse may be the case. As of now, the 48 least developed countries in the world, the poorest countries in the world, have done more planning and are doing more implementation and going up the learning curve of how to do adaptation faster than any developed country. And I would say that we need to do co-production of knowledge where the South learns from each other, so South-South technology transfer, knowledge transfer, but also South to North technology and knowledge transfer. And I would say that in the South, there are many developing countries that are moving ahead on this. I will pick out my country, Bangladesh, as an example and argue that in Bangladesh, the government of Bangladesh, the people of Bangladesh, the researchers in Bangladesh, the NGOs, the media, have all taken on this message 6, 7 years ago. And since then, we have been implementing a climate change strategy and action plan at a very fast rate, which the government of Bangladesh has been investing in with its own money at the level of about $100 million equivalent every year. And we have been going up a knowledge curve very, very fast. And I'll end with one example and one invitation. In particular, our focus is on the most vulnerable communities. And this growing body of knowledge and work and practice on community-based adaptation, which I and my colleagues run an annual conference on. We had the last, which is the 9th in the series, conference in Kenya in April. We had 400 people from all over the world, from about 90 countries, come for 7 days. The first 3 days, we send all the international participants in groups of about 20 or so to spend 2 nights living with a vulnerable community and seeing what they're doing to deal with the problems. And then they come back to a conference setting like this, and we share with plenary and parallel sessions on our knowledge on this. The theme for the conference that we had in April in Kenya was on measuring and enhancing the effectiveness of adaptation, which is a scientific problem at the moment because adaptation is not an easily measured phenomenon, and there's a lot of discussions about how do you monitor and evaluate and measure adaptation going on at the moment. The current paradigm is a very top-down, donor-driven paradigm, which is value for money. We've given you $10, what did you do with the $10? You have to show us what you did with it. And right now, that is what is driving the notions. But the communities, the vulnerable communities, have very different views. It's not about money. Indeed, if it's anything, it's about what you, the polluters, are doing to stop the problem. So we had a very good discussion about that. And the next conference, the 10th in the series, Community-Based Adaptation Conference, will be in Bangladesh in April, from the 21st to the 28th of April. And the theme is going to be on building resilient urban communities. So far, we've tended to focus on rural. This time, we're going to focus on urban communities. And I invite any of you who may be interested to look it up on the website and do come if you're interested. I'm going to use my last minute or so to come back to the issue of Paris in November and December at the Conference of Parties here. I think at the Conference of Parties, adaptation is not the major issue. We have agreement on adaptation several years ago at the Cancun conference where we have the Cancun adaptation framework. We know what we're going to do. Countries are doing national adaptation plans. We need more funding support, but we've been promised a fair amount of support. It's beginning to flow. These are all good things. The most critical thing, as we've just heard from the previous 2 speakers, Fatih and Otmar, is to agree on the mitigation target. Because unlike mitigation, where if you do not emit a ton of carbon, you make the impacts of that 1 ton come down to 0. You avoid them. You cannot avoid impacts with adaptation. Adaptation avoids some, but they're always going to be residual. And the higher the temperature, the less effective adaptation is going to be. So we may be able to adapt to 2 degrees. Some people in some places may not be able to do even that. But 3 degrees, 4 degrees is very doubtful that adaptation will be able to be the solution to that. So we need a solution on the mitigation side, and we're looking to Paris to do that. And I support the previous speakers that this really has to be the major message, the major part of the agreement that comes out on the 11th of December here in Paris this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Hoek. These were a couple of really important messages that I'm sure we are going to follow through. I'm absolutely amazed that all of our speakers were second-wise in time. So also for that, but in general, I would like to ask the floor to thank them very much for their extremely insightful and inspiring presentations. And I'm sure the thoughts and points they have been making are going to stay with us during the rest of the day, and they are going to be reiterated and discussed in many of the panels to come and many of the coffee breaks discussions. So why not we give a big hand, big applause to our keynote speakers. Thank you very much again, and thank you all for enduring one more hour of extremely dense and very powerful information. But now I would like to invite you all to loosen your ties and sit back a little bit and relax, because we have come to the second part of our session, which is going to be a panel discussion where we are going to strike a bit more informal chord. In fact, I apologize in advance if I'm sometimes going to get perhaps a bit too provocative, and I would like to play a little bit the devil's advocate as I'm going to moderate that discussion. So while we are getting a bit more informal, we are not compromising on scholarship. We are very privileged to have four very eminent scholars here today with us, representing a diverse set of perspectives and very interesting perspectives, ensuring a lively debate. So it's difficult to put in any particular order, but let me first invite Dr. Carlos Nobre to the stage. Dr. Nobre is the president of CAPES, the Brazilian funding agency for graduate education. Prior to that, he was director of the Brazilian Center for Monitoring and Alerts of Natural Disasters, and also National Secretary for Research and Development Policy of Brazil's Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation. He's a member of the UN Scientific Advisory Panel for Global Sustainability. He has been chair of the International Biosphere-Geosphere Program, IGBP, between 2005 and 2011. He has also played the role of lead author in Working Group 3 in the 4th assessment report of the IPCC and many other IPCC reports. He is an expert on climate modeling and Amazonian studies. He is member of the TWAS and a foreign member of the US National Academy of Sciences. Dr. Noble, welcome. Our next panelist is Dr. Zhu Dajian. He is a professor at the School of Economics and Management and director of the Institute of Governance for Sustainable Development, as well as vice chairman of the University Academic Committee at the Tongi University in Shanghai. His research interests include sustainable development and green economy, urban and regional development, public service, and public-private partnerships. He's a member of the Circular Economy and Governance for Sustainability under Global Agenda Council of the World Economic Forum. Let's welcome Dr. Zhu. Our next panelist is Dr. Ken Caldeira. He is a climate scientist with the Carnegie Institution for Science at Stanford University. Dr. Caldeira has made contributions in many areas related to climate science. For example, he was a lead author of the first peer-reviewed study appearing in Science to examine energy system implications of climate stabilization at 2-degree warming. He was first author of a seminal Nature paper bringing attention to the issue of ocean acidification. He also co-authored the first climate modeling study of solar geoengineering. He has served the IPCC in roles ranging from reviewer to coordinating lead author. Let's welcome Dr. Caldeira. And last but not least, Dr. Frank Geels is a professor of system innovation and sustainability at the University of Manchester. His research aims to understand the dynamics of socio-technical transitions. He has studied a dozen historical transitions in transport, energy, and agri-food. Frank is chairman of the International Sustainability Transitions Research Network and has been selected into the highly cited researcher list. Let's welcome Dr. Geels. I hope I'm not turning my back on any of the audience, but we would like to discuss with each other. But first, I would like to invite all panelists to give a short 3-minute statement on either reflecting to the previous keynote speeches, or if you want to make any other points related to the subject of today, the solution space. Why not we go in order, Dajian?
I'd like to say two things. First, about innovation. Normally, we say that the technology innovation is important for mitigations. But I want to say this is important, but not enough. We should pay more attention to social innovation. Let me take an example, like transportation. If we use my own cars for mobility, this is technology innovation, which is energy efficient. But if instead we use the car sharing system for mobility, this is social innovation. In some degrees, social innovation is much better than technology innovation in terms of energy efficiency, because technology improvement focuses on the efficiency. Do things right, maybe sometimes in the old track. But social innovation means behavior changes. We should introduce new models of life to do right things in the new directions. So talk about the climate changes, we should need both innovation, but we should pay more attention about the social innovation. This is the one point. The second one I want to say about what's kind of really target about climate change goals. I agree with that the climate change is the environmental agenda, but this is not enough. I want to add, but also that is the development agenda. Let me take China as an example. From environmental agenda, China, as you know, is the biggest emitter by now. But from the development agenda, you find that China, lots of indicators, still is lower. China always says they are emerging economy or developing economies, like lower GDP per capita, lower HDI indicators, and a lower urbanization rate, and so on. So I think we do some climate change economics and do some climate change science. We should combine environment agenda and development agenda. Sometimes, if I can, I want to say the high development with high emission wouldn't be good things. From the same reason, I want to say lower development with lower emission is also not good things. What's our goal? What's our target? I think our target should be higher, more well-being with less emission. This is I want to focus. That's all I want to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ken?
I prepared two slides. I'm not sure if we're able to show them. I guess the first thing I'd like to say is that I'm a physical scientist and my day job is generating empirical facts as objectively as I can. Today I'm here more in a normative and prescriptive role, so it's not my normal activity. So I think one thing we need to do to successfully address the climate problem is think more seriously about envisioning futures full of happy, healthy, prosperous people using energy in ways that will work for the long term. And because we can't really predict the future of technological innovation, we should be conceiving of multiple futures and trying to imagine the kind of world we would like to create. And you know, it's been said that plans are useless, but planning is essential. And so I think keeping the vision on the prize and working positively towards a goal and saying, what do we need to do this year to attain this long-term goal is really important. I think the climate community has focused a lot on presenting the vision of the future we're trying to avoid. It's equally, if not more important, to present a vision of the future that we're trying to create. Next slide, please. So I think, and picking up on what Dajian said, that to solve the climate problem, I think we need to do several things. One is that we need to think of this future in which people are prosperous, healthy, happy, and understand that the energy system transformation and transition that has to occur has to come within the context of development throughout the world, and that includes development in the already developed countries. And that people, it's just not realistic to expect the climate problem to trump all other problems, and climate problem needs to be integrated into the broader development agenda. The other thing is that there's a lot of discussion about energy systems that's based on either wishful thinking or extreme pessimism about different energy technologies, or unrealism about the basic scientific facts that each carbon dioxide emission causes additional warming. To stop the planet from continuing warming, we basically have to stop carbon dioxide emissions. This is extremely challenging from an energy system perspective, but that's the challenge that's in front of us. And the last point I want to make is perhaps a culturally specific one, because yesterday Dajian and I were speaking, and he was feeling in China it's a different way, goes a different way, but at least in the United States, politicians don't lead, they follow, they do what they need to do to get reelected and get money for reelection. And we really need a phase change in the views of the average person, that we need to reach a social tipping point where the average person thinks that it's not okay to build a smokestack, it's not okay to build a tailpipe, it's not okay to use the sky as a waste dump for our greenhouse gas emission. And I think it's only when the average person demands change that our national policies are going to change.
Good morning to all. Thank you very much for the invitation. My take on the solution space this morning will be not on energy, but on land use change, land use change emissions and policy, primarily for the tropics. First, some facts. We know that the pattern of land use change emissions in the tropics have changed in the last 10 years. Today, there are much less emissions than 10 years ago. It's about 10–12% less CO2. 15% is the total greenhouse gas contributions, which is significant. I mean, it's not going to solve the mitigation problem if we continue to reduce emissions from land use, but at least it's significant. So, of course, those reductions came pretty much as a surprise. Nobody predicted 1 decade ago that there would be even a reduction in tropical deforestation, but indeed it happened. Many consider these reductions the low-hanging fruits, low cost, but again, they were not predicted. So we have to try to understand what social transformations was responsible for those changes. And also, those reductions happened throughout the tropics, especially over South America, over the Amazon. RED Plus is a welcome innovation, certainly, but it was not the root cause. It was not working, still at the beginning. So if my take on the simple explanation, particularly for the Amazon I'm more experienced with, and at the Amazon deforestation rates were the highest rates in global deforestation 10 years ago, have to do with a virtuous lock-in of policy, economic, and non-economic drivers. First, the question of values. I think Karen O'Brien yesterday very vividly reminded us of the question of values, and I think they played a very important role for that decline. Public acceptability of deforestation is very low. I don't know if this is widely shared notion. In Brazil, for instance, less than 5% of the people would see a connection between deforestation and the development, and most people oppose of deforestation. That surge of popular support was certainly important in the effectiveness of policy to curb rampant illegal deforestation, at the key to explain reductions. But more importantly, agricultural output in the last 10 years was growing not only in South America, but across the tropical lands, was growing as deforestation was rapidly declining, bearing the myth of continuous agricultural frontier expansion for economic prosperity or food security. I think that was a very important fact, empirical fact. So those facts gave confidence to several tropical countries to implement the deforestation control policies that didn't exist 10 years or 15 years ago. And even currently, they are pledging near zero deforestation by 2030, as a few countries, tropical countries, have already done. And of course, with all the additional benefits to biodiversity protection, ecosystem services. I really hope that all countries, all tropical countries, will take that sustainable pathway and reduce deforestation to nearly zero in the next decade. It's possible, it's doable. It's clear by now that it can be accomplished without really hampering economic development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. That was very interesting. Frank?
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm the chairman of Sustainability Transitions Research Network. We look at sustainability transitions from a different perspective than many of us here do. So we look from evolutionary economics, which is disruptive innovation, science and technology studies, sociology, and political economy. So we are looking at transitions as they unfold in the present and on the ground, rather than about 2050, thinking about fictional futures. In my preliminary comments, I want to make 3 points about the what, who, and how. So the what kind of solutions do we need? I would say we need socio-technical transitions in specific systems: electricity systems, heat systems, transport, and agro-food. Within that, there are 2 stylized transition pathways. One is the large-scale technology pathway, CCS, nuclear, offshore wind, biofuel, battery electric vehicles. And I really have the impression this is the pathway that is really emphasized over and over again in the modeling community. There's also a different pathway, however, which is more around system reconfiguration, which is more about social innovation, business model innovation, and whole systems. So solar PV, rooftop solar PV, city densification, intermodal transport, district heating, biogas, smart grids, all these kind of other types of innovations. And I think it's unclear which one is going to win, but I do feel this community places a bit too much emphasis on the first path, which is rather risky. With regard to the who, I really like that Karen O'Brien yesterday emphasized the importance of actors and agency. This is a slightly different way of looking at the world. She even emphasized the role of game playing with the metaphor of risk. This is a different way of looking at the world rather than variables and abstract parameters. So we need to look much more at agency, strategies, resistance, lock-in, path dependence, these kind of issues, rather than only at the good and the positive. Again, stylized, you have just the first pathway would emphasize the big players, so that's the politicians, the big firms, and the scientific experts. So we just leave it to them to decide what we're going to do. It's a rather top-down technocratic way of decision-making. The second one is more different types of actors, looking at startup firms, citizens, civil society, public discourse, NGOs, and communities. And I did think the last presentation, the last keynote presentation really played on this as well. That is a different kind of governance paradigm rather than this top-down technocratic approach, a much more learning by doing, participatory network governance approach. The third point is the how. I think innovation, I mean, I'm an innovation scholar myself, innovation will be crucial to address these issues. But innovation is not something that just falls from, is manna from heaven, and it's not something that only derives from inputs or context. So inputs is money, and context is the incentives and the regulation, so the emphasis on carbon tax. The inputs and the context are important, but innovation scholars have long ago, 20, 30 years ago, opened up the black box of innovation, and they found it's all done by actors. And actors have beliefs, they have interests, they have capabilities, they have resources, and they make moves in the game, they respond to each other. So that's why I like Karen O'Brien's presentation yesterday very much. So they would see innovation as an endogenous process. It's learning by doing and building alliances. It's building skills and capabilities, but it's also creative destruction. So Schumpeter, this is not mainstream economics, but evolutionary economics. Major change is disruptive. So creative destruction is about new entrants versus incumbents, and there will be turmoil, there will be problems, but there will also be major struggles in political economy and power. So these are some of my preliminary statements. I'm sure they will come more clear as I talk, but you would not so much talk about barriers to change. You would ask more, how can we facilitate endogenous processes to bring change about?
Thank you very much, Frank. Now these statements raise a lot of further thoughts and questions, but let's first perhaps reflect a little bit on the keynote presentations. And I particularly have two questions to two of our panelists today. The first to Carlos. Both, or basically all scenarios going or reaching the 2-degree target, or most of them, rely heavily on negative emission technologies. And it was mentioned in the keynote speeches that this represents a major challenge in terms of bioenergy and biomass and land use. What is your perspective? Do you think it is feasible? Can we crack that nut? Can we rely on negative emission technologies in relation to biomass so heavily?
I think, in the keynote, Otmar has already made some points about that. The uncertainty that CCS, particular for that application, bioenergy, will become acceptable or feasible. So even if you take for granted that eventually that technology may become feasible, but still, I mean, 90% of the scenarios for 2-degree guardrail take for granted negative emissions, mostly from bioenergy. So basically the constraints imposed by land availability, water and food security, and biodiversity protection, for that level, I mean, 10 to 20% of global energy production would come from bioenergy on those scenarios. It seems to be very difficult, not to say impossible. Really, perhaps we should look for other solutions and not rely too much on that possibility in the distant future.
Thank you. The next question is to Dajian. Both keynote speeches referred to China clearly, and Dr. Birol showed that there are some good signs on developments in China. Nevertheless, still some major developments are ahead. He also signaled that perhaps in 2030, if the pledges are respected, then a significant part of Chinese power production is going to be from renewable energy, the new additions. We also heard from Professor Edenhofer that we need to leave a very large share of the coal in the ground. Well, the question is not so much whether we can do it in China, but how could this enormous challenge be tackled in China?
Yeah, China's 2030 target is ambitious, but I want to say still there are bigger challenges for China by 2030. For example, as Atma said, coal still is a bigger question for China. By 2030, coal occupied at least 50% of the whole energy account for China. How to overcome this kind of difficulty is a problem. But anyway, I want to say for the low carbon transition, China has what kind of potentials, as you mentioned. Maybe 3 key elements. The first one is government very strong political awareness, like 2030 report from China said. This is the fundamental elements for China. Why? If you know some about China, I want to say that China's government want to do something. They will be definitely to realize that. From these days, from the China's stock exchange market turbulence, you can find some strong evidence for these ones. So at the moment, China, from inside, we all would say China government has some habit. They promise less, but do some more in the finally. This is the traditional behavior of the Chinese peoples. This is the key elements. The second one is about what's kind of appropriate technology and affordable technology in terms of economic cost, but also in terms of social cost, like a lose job and this kind of issues. The third one is China always takes some top-down approaches. How to, from bottom up, involve different stakeholders into this initiative is the challenges, and also is the opportunities for the Chinese. These are 3 things for your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Ken, you wanted to add something?
To add something about the issue of coal and leaving the fossil fuels in the ground. I mean, obviously that's a crucial question. And I think it's really interesting that this is now increasingly coming onto the agenda in the last couple of years. Because from a Schumpeterian point of view, which is creative destruction, we tend to focus on the creative part, on the renewables. We have focused too little attention on the destruction part of creative destruction. This is, however, not easy. I mean, these are some of the most powerful companies on the planet, the oil companies, the coal companies, the car companies. It's going to be really difficult to convince them to leave this in the ground. However, it's not impossible. There have been examples in the past, of course, where decline has been accelerated, where DDT, with nuclear in some cases, incandescent light bulbs, I mean, they're of a slightly different scale. I mean, Otmar made a really important point, I think, about the importance of carbon pricing. He also made the point it's political suicide for most countries to introduce a carbon price that bites. Luckily, he also had 2 other examples, which he sort of downplayed a little bit too much. So one was the miracles. Of course, miracles don't, I mean, I'm not religious, so I don't think miracles exist. But when he actually talked about the miracles, it was about innovation. He talked about cheap wind and solar. So I don't think they're just miracles. Innovation is something we can make happen, and it can go faster than we anticipated. So I think we need more innovation policy. The second point, which he dismissed too easily, I think, was compensating the losers. I mean, in many transitions, we need to compensate the losers. If not, they are going to fight hand and tooth to resist any carbon price. So I mean, even though it has distributional consequences, for a transition to happen, it may be better to buy them out or to compensate them. In the Netherlands, we had the Dutch state mines, also a coal company, and we helped, when we phased those coal mines out, we helped retrain the employees. We paid them to make the transition to chemical companies. So I think to just place your hope on carbon pricing is, to me, a way too easy way of thinking. And for me, it's a typical economist way of thinking, which is just when we have the price ready, then innovation will follow suit. And I think that's why I emphasize the importance of innovation as an endogenous process. it is also about the actors. It's about their beliefs, how you can persuade them. So I think we need innovation policy, we need to compensate the losers, and we need a carbon price. But the exclusive emphasis on a carbon price, I think, is a delusion.
Thank you. Ken, you wanted to add something?
I think the case of China illustrates several important things. One is this issue of blending development goals with climate change goals. And the other issue that it raises is kind of this question, is somebody doing good by driving a Prius because they're not driving a Ford Explorer, or is it doing something bad because CO2 is still coming out of the tailpipe? And so I think an important question is, what can we do that would help China adopt stronger policies? And you know, while the price on carbon is not the answer to all questions, it's a good start on a big part of the answer. And I think if the United States had a strong price on carbon, increasing exponentially, and Europe did as well, that it would be much easier for China to adopt similar policies. So I think, and then I think the other issue with the development is, you know, what's the responsibility of the richer countries to help finance some of this transition in the poorer countries?
Thank you. Now, let's go back to your extremely interesting statements. Actually, I was quite surprised, because if we look at both the keynote speeches and we look at the fifth assessment report, the vast majority is about technologies, pricing, models. Nevertheless, most of you, actually all of you, chose to spend your 3 minutes of fame on, actually all of you mentioned the word social in one way or another. You mentioned social innovation, social tipping point, social transformation, values, public acceptance, and so on. Now, we don't model these. These are even very marginally in, for example, the IPCC assessment reports. Is there a contradiction? What's the solution? We mostly support, and most governments work with technologies, but you're alluding to more social issues.
Right now, the United States is spending something like 20% of GDP on healthcare, something like 10% of GDP on our military budget. And economists estimate that solving the climate problem will be a few percent of GDP. And so it's something of the magnitude that society does today. I think there's confidence that while the technological problems are formidable, that they can be solved if there was the political and social will to solve those problems. And so, yes, we need research and development and learning about technologies, but really getting over this game theoretic problem of that we need to sacrifice for the greater good, and that's a tough social nut to crack. But I think if we can crack that nut, the remaining fruits will be easy to consume, shall we say.
Jean-François?
We heard of the importance of carbon capture and sequestration in the different scenarios. Would you think that if we have more bioenergy, because we do not use CCS, this will create some opportunities for the social dimensions, or would it create some more problems? Maybe Carlos, if you'd like to.
Again, I mean, I think we went through. To my understanding, I think given the scale, I mean, scaling up, bioenergy is being used in some countries, particularly in my own country, in US and a few other countries in Europe. Maybe a solution localized. However, scaling it up to this level, 10, 20, 30% of global energy by the end of this century is a completely new dimension. In that dimension, I'm not sure you create more opportunities. I think you create more problems.
Frank, you wanted to come back on the social issue?
Well, more on the issue of innovation generally, which is both technical innovation and social innovation. And from my view at looking of the world, I mean, government is only one actor amongst many. So I'm more in favor of governance, which is a multi-actor process. So that means governments cannot make anything happen as they want it. It's more about modulating things that are happening on the ground. And I think if you see what is happening on the ground, I mean, CCS, we've been talking about it for the last 5 or 10 years, and it's actually not happening. The number of projects CCS is decreasing. The same battery electric vehicles are not diffusing as fast as we thought, the same with heat pumps and nuclear as well. So I do sometimes feel this community keeps repeating the same messages of the large-scale options, and they're not really happening, so that does surprise me. Also, the point, innovation is very much a non-linear, unexpected dynamic, and I'm much more in favor of trying to unleash energy in society. I think solar PV is not just interesting because of the tremendous cost improvements. It's also interesting because even though it was one of the most expensive options for citizens, it was an option that citizens started deploying, completely unexpected. None of the modelers was expecting this to happen because it's the most expensive option. There is apparently a lot of enthusiasm for citizens or communities to do things. The same applies to car sharing, which has taken off in a very rapid way. There's transition town movements happening, eco-cities, community energy. They are very small scale, as you rightly point out. And maybe they're not the ultimate answer, but at least they create a buy-in from citizens. They can do something on the ground. They generate energy literacy. That then creates more pressure on policymakers. I don't think policymakers can just listen to the experts and the modelers and decide, oh, we're going to do this and this. That's a highly technocratic and dangerous way of going along. You need to bring society along, particularly if this transition is going to happen for 30, 40 years. There are also, of course, negative developments like shale gas, which no one really saw coming until 5 years ago. A positive example maybe is electric bicycles. I think in China are taking off, even though the government wanted to go electric vehicles. It's electric bicycles, unexpectedly we took off. Intermittent renewables, we find we can do much more on the grid. 5 or 10 years ago we thought maybe 5%, but we can manage with the grid now, it's up to 30%. The same with co-firing of biomass and coal. Was initially we thought we can only do a few percent, now it can be 20, 30%. So I think innovation is a highly non-linear thing. It's very unexpected dynamics which it can unleash. I really like the emphasis of the last pre-note speaker on learning by doing. And you can't, I mean, the models, I mean, technology is technology, but also social innovation, they are just not modeled very well. And that's a little bit my hesitation with these 2050 scenarios and the negative emissions which we just make up out of thin air. I think it is better to look at what's going on the ground and ask how you can accelerate these dynamics.
I think for the social issue and the governance issues, we should combine top-down approaches and bottom-up. Normally in the Europe bottom-up approaches is playing a major role. For China, top-down approaches is working for that. Maybe different degrees of the combination rely on different contexts. China always government-driven. In US, maybe more market-driven. Europeans is the civil society-driven. So we should have the same target, but different models of social governance network. This kind of issue should be pay more attention. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, you've made very interesting points about social innovation and governance approaches. Some of this, we are in a science conference after all. Still, the models, what mostly provide inputs of economics and pricing and technology into decision making, are still not able to capture much of this. Do you think there is still a gap between these areas of research and these areas of inquiry and technological research? Should we try to bridge this gap, or how can we better integrate research and science in social innovation, governance, institutions, and the more economic and technological modeling and literature?
Well, that's a really good and very important question. Because I think we need the models. Absolutely, we need the models. They are the only way to really think in a systematic way about long-term futures. I mean, however, models need to make, by definition, many kind of assumptions in order to model things. So there's no real actors in there, there's no power, no political economy, very little learning, very little about beliefs and these kind of things. So that's fine, you need to make assumptions, but you need the models to think about the long term. However, I think we also need to look much more at what's going on the present. So this is, I mean, we've developed a framework which looks at niche innovations, at regimes, at actors and political economy. So let's look a little bit at the current structures and what are the actors doing in different directions. And then you could have a third kind of approach, which is looking much more at on-the-ground learning by doing. So that's looking at what is happening at cities, which have been emphasized a few times. In communities, this is almost like microcosms where transitions are being played out on the ground. And they are much more messy and localized, where actors are struggling, building alliances, the mayor needs to be on board, and maybe someone against it. And I think we need all three kind of approaches, because they play a different kind of scientific criteria. I mean, you've got three criteria. One is scope and generality. The second is parsimony and simplicity. And the fourth is accuracy and specificity, which is looking at what's going on the ground. And no particular approach can do all three. And I think the models are really good at scope and simplicity. They're not very good at specificity and looking at what's going on the ground. So I do think we need multiple kind of approaches to understand transitions.
Thank you. Ken?
I think the integrated assessment models of the sort that Otmar showed us are essential. While being obviously incomplete, they force people to be explicit about their technological assumptions, their economic assumptions, and also force people to grapple with the scale of the issue. And so while the models are not definitive in any way, they're extremely useful for helping thinking about futures in an explicit kind of way. Regarding the importance of social science, I think we really need to understand how social norms develop and propagate. In the United States, we recently saw a transition where gay marriage went from being broadly seen as unacceptable to now being seen as acceptable. In the 19th century, England got out of the slave trade and lost 2% of GDP because they found it unacceptable. And I think understanding what causes changes in social norms and how do societies go through that phase change where something that was formerly acceptable becomes unacceptable or vice versa is very important. It's not specific necessarily to climate, but understanding how those transitions happen, I think, will be important to solving the climate problem.
Jean-François?
We now can see that in the climate negotiations there is this idea of developing an agenda of solutions. And with such an agenda, I think that the concept is that countries, but also the civil society, would collaborate on some given options and try to develop those options with increased international collaboration. Would this match the sort of criteria that you have been mentioning for the development of innovation?
Well, I think it's important, obviously, this cross-country collaboration and also the South-North, which I think was rightly emphasized. However, it's not exactly what I would emphasize. I would emphasize more issues like multi-level governance, which is less between the governments of different countries. I mean, that is important as well, and the financial flows and the technical flows. But multi-level governance is more about a scalar kind of approach, which is what's going on the ground in cities, it's at sectors, and it's also about nations and economy-wide. And I did read the recent IPCC report, and I felt almost reluctantly it was admitted that the economy-wide instruments of a carbon price are not really happening. It was almost reluctantly say, well, actually those countries that do make progress do innovation policy. China and Germany, Denmark, Brazil, some of the others. Yeah, that's why I think that's why we need a multi-scalar kind of approach rather, and the country collaboration is part of that, but it's not the only. It's not what I would place most of my hope on.
Thank you. many of you have discussed already a little bit about top-down versus bottom-up, learning by doing and starting from the ground, and our keynote speakers also referred to this. Now, at the same time, we are heading and we're preparing for this big meeting in Paris about the global regime. Now, within these two worldviews, in one, trying to scale up the excellent initiatives on the ground by cities and citizens and associations, that a lot of which we are going to hear in the rest of the different sessions today. Is it possible to scale these up to a level that's going to make a major difference in terms of emissions? On the other hand, another worldview is to have a major global agreement and have word police, that's you know, everyone committing to a major reduction and putting up a big global carbon price, and this global government implementing a ban on automobiles and imprisoning anyone who's not turning off the lights. So these two worldviews, clearly we need something in between, but can the two meet? If there is a little bit of this and a little bit of that, will that be sufficient? Will the two meet in between in order to be able to meet the grand challenge of growing, of these scenarios going down to the bottom right corner of the screen?
I think the small bottom-up activities are primarily useful for helping generate the change in societal norms about how it's okay to generate and use energy. But really, we're embedded in a system where we plug our toaster into the wall, and where the energy comes from we don't directly control. And if we want to get someplace, there's only a limited number of transportation options. And so really, to solve the problem, we need to revolutionize our systems of energy production, consumption, transportation, and so on. And these can't be done from a bottom-up way. So both are important, but if we don't have the top-down systemic approach, it's not going to work.
What does a transition researcher think about such a question?
Well, if I take a longer-term view, I mean, we entered a neoliberal governance era since the 1980s, which also means it's not going to be there likely to be forever. I mean, I think definitely we need a stronger government approach, which does not necessarily mean regulatory kind of approach, but it does mean a government that takes more responsibility rather than just tinkering with the incentives. And I think, well, obviously the crisis really helped in that, where all of a sudden the neoliberal principles were dropped and the state stepped in very strongly. So we could move more in that direction. The governance literature distinguishes three governance paradigms. You've got a market-based kind of paradigm, where it's about the incentives. You've got a regulatory kind of approach, which is a bit more often top-down. And you've got network governance, which is more about facilitating actors, learning processes, demonstration, and visioning. Because I do agree the bottom-up or the small scale is important, but we should not be too romantic that this will be the entire solution. So I thought Ken's point that this is important to generate commitment and value change is really crucial. But I do think the current debate in this community is primarily on the first two kind of governance paradigm. Either it's the market-based and then the hope of a carbon price, or it's the regulatory one, where we just have a target agreed in December and then all the rest will follow. And I think they are both important. It's not going to happen without those tools. But I think we need much more network governance, which is not just about single initiatives. It's about connecting them. It's about knowledge flows. There's too much in reinventing the wheel of those small local communities. They often don't talk enough to each other. So the challenge is how you can actually have all three approaches next to each other. And I think we first need much more network governance, and only then is there a place for stronger regulation and stronger market-based approaches.
Thank you. Now, as a last round of questions, I would like everyone to think a bit more about this, each of you to think a bit more about the major challenge that we are heading. And I guess We have seen the technological pathways, we have seen the economic solutions, now we have discussed institutions. But we all still agree that this is a tremendous challenge. What, in your view, can trigger a massive change? What is the key, what we really need to do to start the change? Especially in your countries, what do you think in your countries is going to make the difference, is going to push the political will beyond the tipping point to cause a strong political commitment in your country to solve climate change? And let's go one by one. Dajian.
About CC, first come from the outside of China. Then the leadership put into the mainstream plan. But I think the major reasons come from the bottom up, from the ordinary people. You know, in the last 30 years, China's development is always GDP oriented. From the government to the peoples care so much about GDPs in terms of very high economic growth rate, but with high social cost and environmental cost. So nowadays, they are facing the turning point, how to shift from the older version to the new version. Now the climate changes is outside force, combining to the inside willingness. So you can see that in the last several decades will be moved to the quality of life, because as the population of the middle class peoples getting more and more, they care so much about the quality of life, shift from the GDPs. I think this is the final driving force to the China will becoming them very strong into these initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you. Ken.
I think in the United States, a lot of the discussion of the climate change problem has been very wonky and not something that has reached the average person. And so in my own communication, I've shifted to trying to speak in single syllable words and saying, oh, let's not use the sky as a waste dump, and talking about that we shouldn't be building things with tailpipes and smokestacks. And I think the average person can get behind those ideas. And then to present a positive vision of a world with a good energy system and a prosperous economy. But I think it's trying to reach the average person and developing a political consensus.
Thank you. Carlos.
I think in Brazil, the situation is slightly different. Most people, although science literacy is not high, but still intuitively, most people support policy actions for climate. So I think that gives the basis for policy, for government and governance policies. And I think that the prospects are not bad. For instance, I think it's well known Brazil has been reducing emissions. So mitigation policies are moving, mostly due to reducing deforestation. But today, per capita emissions in Brazil is 6.5 tons of CO2 equivalent. I think it's doable to have a target of 4 by 2030. Basically, zero net deforestation and modest increases in carbon intensity, energy intensity, and the carbon intensity agricultural sector. Modest. Of course, if we have this ultimate goal of getting down to 2 tons per capita, 2050, I think it's a global desire, then the challenges are much, much higher. Population, we will stabilize in Brazil within the next 20, 25 years. But prosperity will bring more need for energy and agricultural production. So then there has to be transformative changes, particularly in social innovation, in agricultural, sustainable agriculture, and also renewable energy. Brazil has plenty, but the transition to renewable energy in Brazil has been very slow. So I think the major challenges will be a long-term view towards mitigation policies which will work. But I'm very hopeful, I'm very optimistic that Brazil will contribute to that.
Well, that's good to hear. So let's go, finally, let's end with Europe.
Well, in the UK, of course, has been a leader in climate change policy with the Climate Change Act of 2008. And since then, there's been quite a lot of progress in the electricity domain. I mean, in the heat domain, in the food domain, and in the transport domain, progress is much less. But if I focus on the electricity domain, the reason much progress has been made is that they basically have paid the incumbents a lot of money. So in a recent paper, I've characterized the UK pattern as working with incumbents, which is very different from a Schumpeterian pattern, which would be working with new entrants. So they've made the renewables obligation and now a contract for difference. And that is a way of making fast progress, just throwing lots of money at it. That's not a carbon price. You just pay them to create an ensured market, which allows upscaling, which allows learning by doing. So there is lots of progress being made. The problem is, or the risk is, lack of legitimacy. So it's all done by the big firms and the politicians and some of the contractors. It's very vulnerable to the high cost argument, which is being used by politicians very much on the right. So it's very vulnerable. Even the Climate Change Act may be under threat. So I think to move forward further and faster, it just needs to be broadened, I think, this approach, because you cannot just leave society on the side and ask them to foot the bill without them being properly included in this transition process. So for me, the need to speed up is creating more space for new entrants, which would be a proper Schumpeterian approach. You also need social movement pressure, otherwise politicians are not going to move. So the Guardian campaign is one, but you also need a wider range of NGOs. And you probably need to engage citizens, give them a broader role and voice in this transition, because otherwise this is going to run out of steam.
Wow, what a span of different solutions. That's really encouraging that each of you find a different and new way of how to tip the political will and make a real commitment to solving climate change. Now, I'm sure we could continue here for hours and still not crack some of the really important nuts, but I'm afraid time is up. So we need to thank our panelists for the excellent and very interesting thoughts. Don't go yet. And I would like to wish everyone a very productive day where we continue to explore the different elements of the solution space. And I hope the keynote speakers and the panel have provided enough inspiration for you to have more debates over the coffee and within the panels. But before we conclude, please do listen to Jean-François Susanna for the last words.
Thank you. Just a few household keeping announcements. Please remember we have the social event this evening at the university, UPMC. This will be at 7:30 p.m. So please bring your posters with you, because there will be a major poster session there. Then I'd like to remind you that you need to buy your metro tickets a bit in advance, otherwise there will be some queue. And also I should say that you're not allowed to eat in the session rooms. I have a few announcements concerning the printed program. Sometimes the printed program is not up to date, so please refer to the website. And in particular, we have session 33-38, European Collaborative Research. The printed room is not correct. The room will be room 13 at UNESCO at the Maolis site. Then we have Planetary Economics 2237B, which will be actually at room 7 at Fontenoy at UNESCO. And also in the printed program, some errors about the timing. If you go to information for decision making, please note the session will be at 3 p.m. And if you go to climate change and development alleviating poverty, please note it will be at 2 p.m. Thanks very much.